Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had always been invisible. At Langley Air Force Base, home to the most advanced fighter jets in the world, she was just another face in coveralls, another pair of hands maintaining the billion-dollar machines that soared through Virginia skies. While pilots walked the halls like celebrities, signing autographs and posing for photos with visiting dignitaries, Maria crawled through engine compartments, her hands blackened with hydraulic fluid and her uniform stained with the honest sweat of hard work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria had joined the Air Force 8 years ago with dreams that extended far beyond a wrench and a toolbox. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had watched jets streak across the endless sky and imagined herself at the controls, dancing through clouds at speeds that would make her heart race. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her test scores were exceptional in mechanical aptitude, but fell just short in the areas needed for pilot training. The recruiter had smiled sympathetically and steered her toward aircraft maintenance. A vital role, he assured her, though one that would keep her feet firmly planted on the ground. Now, at 26, Maria had become one of the most skilled F-22 Raptor technicians at Langley. She knew every rivet, every wire, every system in the stealth fighter that represented the pinnacle of American air superiority. The F-22 was a marvel of engineering, a twin-engine, all-weather, stealth tactical fighter aircraft that could cruise at supersonic speeds without using afterburners, reach altitudes of over 60,000 feet, and turn on a dime with thrust vectoring technology that defied conventional understanding of flight dynamics. Maria could diagnose problems that stumped other technicians. She had an almost supernatural ability to listen to an engine and know exactly what was wrong, to feel vibrations through the airframe that told stories of stress and wear that others couldn't read. Her supervisors praised her work. Pilots trusted her completely with their lives, and yet she remained in the shadows of the flight line, watching others live the dream she had never been allowed to pursue. The morning that would change everything started like any other. The humid Virginia air hung heavy over the tarmac as Maria arrived at 0500 for her shift. The F-22s sat in their hangars like sleeping predators, their angular surfaces designed to slice through radar waves as easily as they cut through air. Maria grabbed her clipboard and began her routine inspection of Raptor 054098, call sign Ghostwriter, assigned to Captain Jake Viper Morrison. Captain Morrison was different from most pilots. While others barely acknowledged the maintenance crews, Morrison made a point to know everyone who worked on his aircraft. He understood that his life depended not just on his skill in the cockpit, but on the expertise of people like Maria, who ensured his fighter was in perfect condition every time he climbed into that cockpit. "Morning, Santos," Morrison said as he approached his aircraft, already dressed in his flight suit and carrying his helmet. "How's she looking today?" "Good morning, sir," Maria replied, not looking up from her checklist. "All systems green. I replaced the number 2 engine's temperature sensor yesterday. It was reading slightly high, nothing dangerous, but I wanted to be sure." Morrison paused, studying Maria with the same intensity he brought to reading enemy radar signatures. "You know, Santos, I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never met a maintainer who understands these birds like you do. You don't just fix problems, you prevent them." Maria felt heat rise to her cheeks. Compliments from pilots were rare, and coming from Morrison, they meant something special. "Just doing my job, sir." "No," Morrison said, shaking his head. "You're doing a lot more than that." He paused for a moment, seeming to wrestle with the decision. "Can I ask you something personal?" Maria finally looked up, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir." "Did you ever want to fly?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow. For 8 years, she had buried that dream so deep that most days she could pretend it had never existed. But Morrison's direct gaze seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. "Everyone who works around these machines dreams of flying them, sir," she said carefully, deflecting the personal nature of the question. Morrison nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." Maria set down her clipboard and met his eyes. Something in his expression told her that this wasn't casual conversation. "Yes, sir. I did. I do."
Why didn't you apply for pilot training? My scores weren't quite high enough, Maria said, the old disappointment creeping back into her voice. I was close, but close doesn't get you into the cockpit of an F-22. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and Maria could almost see the gears turning in his head. Finally, he spoke. Santos, I'm scheduled for a routine training flight this afternoon. Local area, just some basic maneuvers and systems checks. How would you like to come along? Maria's heart stopped. Sir? The F-22 has provisions for maintenance flights with qualified personnel. You're more qualified than most to understand what this aircraft is capable of. Consider it professional development. Maria's mind raced. Maintenance personnel did occasionally fly in military aircraft for various reasons, but in an F-22, the single-seat stealth fighter didn't even have room for passengers. She was about to voice this confusion when Morrison continued. We've got a two-seat trainer variant coming in next week for some specialized testing. But today, if you're interested, you could observe from the ground control station. Watch this bird is really capable of when she's in her element. It wasn't the same as flying, but it was more than Maria had ever dared to hope for. The chance to see her work, her aircraft, performing the mission it was designed for, to understand the full scope of what she maintained every day. I would be honored, sir, she said, trying to keep the excitement from her voice. Morrison smiled, an expression that transformed his usually serious face. Good. Meet me at operations at 1400. And Santos. He paused as he prepared to walk away. Bring your flight suit. You never know what might happen.
As Captain Morrison walked away, Maria stood frozen on the tarmac, his words echoing in her mind. Bring your flight suit. You never know what might happen. What could that possibly mean? The F-22 Raptor was a single-seat fighter. There was no passenger version, no instructor seat, no way for a maintenance technician to suddenly find herself airborne in the most advanced fighter jet ever built. Or was there? Maria spent the morning going through the motions of her routine maintenance checks, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself staring at the sleek lines of the F-22s, imagining what it would feel like to see the world from 50,000 feet, to feel the raw power of twin Pratt & Whitney F119 engines pushing her through the sky at Mach 2.25. The very idea seemed impossible, yet Morrison's words had carried an undertone of possibility that she couldn't shake. During her lunch break, Maria retreated to the squadron's resource library and pulled up technical manuals on F-22 configurations. She knew the aircraft inside and out from a maintenance perspective, but she had never studied the various test and training configurations that might exist. What she found made her heart race. Buried in a classified appendix was information about the F-22B, a two-seat variant that had been developed for advanced training and testing purposes. Only a handful had ever been built, and they were so classified that even their existence was compartmentalized information. The second seat was typically used for flight test engineers, advanced systems operators, or in rare cases, for training purposes under very specific circumstances. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the specifications. The second seat had full flight controls, complete instrumentation, and could be configured for pilot training under the supervision of a qualified instructor pilot. It was designed to allow non-pilots to experience the aircraft's capabilities for engineering evaluation and system testing purposes. Could Morrison have access to one of these rare variants? Was that what he meant by the cryptic comment about bringing her flight suit? The afternoon couldn't come fast enough. At exactly 13:55 hours, Maria appeared at the operations building, her flight suit pressed and her boots polished to mirror shine. She had spent 20 minutes debating whether to actually bring the gear, ultimately deciding that following Morrison's instruction exactly was the safer course of action. Morrison was waiting for her, along with someone Maria didn't recognize, a tall woman in a flight suit with colonel's eagles on her collar and test pilot wings on her chest. The woman studied Maria with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "Santos, I'd like you to meet Colonel Rebecca Chen, our chief test pilot," Morrison said. Colonel, this is Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the technician I was telling you about. Colonel Chen extended her hand. Captain Morrison speaks very highly of your work, Sergeant. He tells me you have an almost supernatural understanding of the F-22 systems. I wouldn't go that far, ma'am, Maria replied, shaking the colonel's hand and noting the firm, confident grip. Modesty is admirable, but false modesty wastes everyone's time, Chen said with a slight smile. Morrison showed me your maintenance records. In 8 years, you've never signed off on an aircraft that subsequently experienced a system failure. Never. That's not luck, Sergeant. That's skill. Maria felt a flush of pride, but tried to maintain her composure. I just believe in being thorough, ma'am. Good answer, Chen said. She exchanged a look with Morrison that seemed to communicate volumes. Sergeant Santos, what I'm about to tell you is classified. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am, Maria replied, her pulse quickening. We have a special test aircraft arriving this afternoon. It's an F-22B variant, 2-seat configuration, here for evaluation of new systems integration protocols. The flight requires both a qualified test pilot and a systems specialist who understands the aircraft's maintenance requirements at an expert level. Maria's mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Ma'am, I'm not a pilot. I don't have flight training. No, but you understand these aircraft better than most pilots understand their own cars, Morrison interjected. This particular test profile requires someone who can monitor multiple systems simultaneously, recognize anomalies before they become problems, and communicate technical issues clearly and quickly. Colonel Chen nodded. The second seat has full flight controls, but for this mission, your role would be as a systems monitor and, if necessary, backup systems operator. Captain Morrison would be pilot in command throughout the flight. Maria felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Ma'am, are you offering me the opportunity to fly in an F-22? I'm offering you the opportunity to do your job at 50,000 feet, Chen replied. This is a legitimate test mission, Sergeant. We need someone with your technical expertise to evaluate system performance under flight conditions. The fact that it happens to involve flight time is incidental. Morrison stepped closer. Santos, I've been watching you for 2 years. You don't just maintain these aircraft, you understand them. When you sign off on a bird, I know it's going to perform exactly as designed. That level of expertise is rare, and it's exactly what we need for this mission. Maria's voice came out as barely a whisper. When? The test aircraft arrives at 1600 hours. If you accept this assignment, we'll conduct a brief systems familiarization, review emergency procedures, and launch at 1800 hours for a 2-hour evaluation flight. This is really happening? Maria asked, still not quite believing what she was hearing. Morrison smiled. Santos, in about 4 hours, you're going to see your work from a perspective that very few people ever experience. You're going to understand what these machines are really capable of and why your job matters so much. Colonel Chen checked her watch. I need a decision, Sergeant. This mission is scheduled whether you're on board or not, but having your expertise would make it significantly more valuable. Maria thought of all the times she had watched F-22s disappear into the sky, carrying pilots to adventures she could only imagine. She thought of the dreams she had buried, the compromises she had made, the accepting smile she had learned to wear when people asked if she ever wanted to do more than fix airplanes. Yes, ma'am, she said, her voice growing stronger. I accept the assignment. Colonel Chen nodded approvingly. Outstanding! Let's get you briefed. The briefing room felt surreal as Maria found herself seated between 2 of the most experienced pilots on the base, listening to a flight plan that included her name in the crew manifest. Colonel Chen stood at the front of the room, pointing to charts and diagrams that Maria had only seen in technical manuals, but now they represented a flight path she would actually experience. The test profile is straightforward, Chen explained. We'll launch at 1800, climb to 45,000 feet, and conduct systems evaluation in several flight regimes. Sergeant Santos, your primary responsibility will be monitoring the integrated systems display and calling out any anomalies you observe. The test includes high-G maneuvering, supersonic flight, and stealth systems evaluation. Maria tried to absorb the technical details while simultaneously grappling with the reality that she would be experiencing these maneuvers firsthand. High-G maneuvering meant forces that can make a person unconscious if they weren't prepared. Supersonic flight meant traveling faster than the speed of sound, something that still seemed like science fiction despite her years working around aircraft capable of such speeds. Physical preparation is crucial, Morrison added. Santos, you'll need to complete an abbreviated physiological training session. We're talking about forces your body has never experienced. For the next hour, Maria received a crash course in high-performance flight physiology. She learned breathing techniques to maintain consciousness during high-G turns, practiced the muscle tensing exercises that would prevent blood from pooling in her extremities, and studied the symptoms of hypoxia and spatial disorientation that could affect anyone flying at extreme altitudes. The most challenging part was the ejection seat training. The Martin Baker ACES II ejection seat in the F-22B was designed to save lives, but it was also a controlled explosion that could cause serious injury if not used properly. Maria practiced the ejection position, feet flat on footrests, back pressed firmly against the seat, head against the headrest, and arms tucked in tight to avoid flailing during the violent acceleration of ejection. Remember, the safety officer emphasized, if Captain Morrison calls eject, 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 you pull that handle without hesitation. The seat will take you clear of the aircraft and your parachute will deploy automatically. Don't think, don't hesitate, just pull. At 15:45, they walked to the flight line where the F-22B sat waiting. Maria had never seen this variant before. It looked like a standard F-22, but slightly longer to accommodate the second cockpit. The aircraft was immaculate, its stealth coating seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ground crews were completing final preparations, and Maria felt a strange, surreal moment recognizing some of her fellow maintainers preparing an aircraft she was about to fly in, rather than service. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Morrison said, noting Maria's expression. "I've worked on dozens of F-22s, but seeing one I'm about to fly in? It's different," Maria admitted. Colonel Chan approached with Maria's helmet and survival gear. "Sergeant, this is it. Once you strap into that aircraft, you're no longer just maintenance personnel. You're crew. Act like it." The process of suiting up was methodical and precise. Maria donned her G-suit, which would inflate during high-G maneuvers to help maintain blood circulation. The survival vest contained everything she might need if they had to eject over land or water. Radio, flares, food, water purification tablets, and a dozen other items designed to keep her alive until rescue arrived. The helmet was the final piece, equipped with night vision capability, heads-up display, and communication systems that would keep her connected to Morrison and ground control throughout the flight. When she put it on, Maria felt the psychological transformation Chen had mentioned. She was no longer just along for the ride, she was part of the crew. Walking to the aircraft, Maria's legs felt unsteady, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this moment was actually happening. 8 years of dreams deferred, of watching others live the adventure she had wanted, and now she was about to experience it herself. Morrison conducted the external pre-flight inspection with Maria, but this time, her perspective was entirely different. Instead of checking systems she would send someone else to use, she was verifying systems that would keep her alive for the next 2 hours. Every rivet, every access panel, every sensor took on new significance when her own life depended on their proper function. "You ready for this?" Morrison asked as they prepared to climb into the aircraft. Maria looked up at the sleek fighter, its twin engines ready to propel her into an experience she had only imagined. "Sir, I've been ready for 8 years." Morrison smiled and climbed a ladder to the front cockpit. Maria followed, settling into the rear seat that would be her office for the next 2 hours. The cockpit was cramped, every surface covered with switches, displays, and controls, but Maria understood the purpose of every component. She had maintained these systems, and now she would operate them. The canopy closed with a solid thunk, sealing them into their pressurized capsule. Maria connected her oxygen, intercom, and G-suit connections, running through the checklist that would keep her alive and conscious during the flight ahead. "Langley ground, Ghost Rider 01, 2 souls on board, request taxi for departure." Maria's voice crackled through the intercom.
Maria felt the engine spool up, their familiar whine now coming from directly behind her rather than from an aircraft she was servicing. The F-22 began to roll, and for the first time in her Air Force career, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was moving toward the runway not as ground crew, but as air crew. "You still with me back there, Santos?" Morrison asked as they approached the runway. "Yes, sir," Maria replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "All systems showing green." "Outstanding. Towers cleared us for departure. Next stop, 45,000 feet." Maria gripped the sides of her seat as Morrison pushed the throttles forward and released the brakes. The F-22 leapt forward with acceleration that pressed her back into her seat, and within seconds, they were airborne, climbing steeply into the Virginia sky that had been the ceiling of Maria's dreams for so long.
The moment they left the ground, Maria's entire world transformed. The familiar landscape of Langley Air Force Base, which she had seen countless times from ground level, suddenly spread out beneath her like a living map. The runways she had walked along for years now looked like thin gray lines, and the massive hangars that had seemed so imposing were reduced to rectangular boxes scattered across the Virginia countryside. "How are you doing back there, Santos?" Morrison's voice came through the intercom, steady and professional despite the incredible forces they were experiencing. "Systems all green, sir," Maria managed, though her voice betrayed the awe she was feeling. "This is incredible." Morrison chuckled. "We haven't even gotten started yet. Watch this." He pulled back on the stick, and the F-22 entered a steep climb that pressed Maria deep into her seat. The altimeter spun rapidly, 10,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet. Through her helmet's heads-up display, Maria could see readings that she had only monitored from ground control stations: airspeed, altitude, engine performance, and dozens of other parameters that told the story of their ascent. At 25,000 feet, they broke through a layer of clouds, and Maria gasped. Above the clouds, the sky was a brilliant blue she had never seen before, so pure and clear, it seemed artificial. The sun shone with an intensity that made her squint even through her helmet's tinted visor. Below, the cloud layer stretched to the horizon like a vast white ocean, with occasional peaks of taller clouds rising like islands. "Welcome to my office," Morrison said. "This is what I get to see every day, thanks to people like you keeping these birds flying." Maria tried to process what she was experiencing. The G-forces from their climb had been manageable, but she could feel the unfamiliar sensations in her body, the slight lightheadedness from the rapid altitude change, the pressure variations that made her ears pop, and the strange feeling of acceleration in 3 dimensions rather than the simple forward motion she was used to in cars. "Approaching test altitude," Morrison announced, 45,000 feet. "Maria, I want you to monitor the systems display and call out anything unusual. We're going to put this bird through her paces." At 25,000 feet, the sky above was so dark it was almost black, even in daylight. Maria realized she was higher than most commercial airliners ever flew, in the realm where only military jets and specialized aircraft operated. The curvature of the Earth was clearly visible, and she could see hundreds of miles in every direction. "Systems check complete," Maria reported, her professional training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. "All parameters nominal." "Outstanding. Now let's see what she can really do." Morrison rolled the aircraft into a series of maneuvers that Maria had only read about in technical manuals. They performed barrel rolls, loops, and high G turns that pushed the limits of both the aircraft and the human body. The G-suit inflated around Maria's legs and torso during the most aggressive maneuvers, helping maintain blood flow to her brain and preventing her from losing consciousness. In one particularly aggressive turn, Maria felt forces she had never imagined. Her body pressed against the side of the cockpit with what felt like 3 times its normal weight. The world spun around them in a controlled chaos of blue sky, white clouds, and brown earth. And Maria began to understand why pilots talked about flying as the ultimate freedom. "How are you doing back there, G's?" Morrison asked as they leveled out. "Better than I expected," she replied, surprised by her own resilience. "The training helped, but experiencing it is completely different.
You're doing great. Most first-time flyers are either unconscious or airsick by now. As they continued their test profile, Maria found herself naturally adapting to her role as systems monitor. Her years of experience with F-22 maintenance gave her an intuitive understanding of what the aircraft should be doing, and she could interpret the instrument readings in ways that complemented Morrison's piloting skills. Engine temps look slightly elevated on the number 2 engine, she reported during a high-speed run. I see it. Still within parameters, but good catch. That's exactly the kind of monitoring we need. They flew supersonic for several minutes, breaking the sound barrier with barely a shudder from the advanced airframe. Maria watched the Mach meter climb past 1.0, 1.5, then 1.8, speeds that turned the landscape below into a blur, and made her realize just how fast human beings could travel when engineering and physics worked in perfect harmony. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stealth systems test was perhaps the most fascinating part of the flight for Maria. Morrison flew specific patterns while ground-based radar attempted to track them. Through the aircraft's passive sensors, they could monitor the radar beams sweeping across their position, most of them passing right through the F-22's specially designed surfaces without detecting their presence. It's like being invisible, Maria marveled, as they flew directly through radar coverage that would have easily detected any conventional aircraft. That's exactly what it is, Morrison replied. The shape, the coating, even the way the engines are buried in the airframe, everything about this aircraft is designed to avoid detection. You maintain the systems that make this possible. As they continued their test mission, Maria began to understand her work from an entirely new perspective. Every system she had ever serviced, every component she had ever replaced, every checklist she had ever completed, all of it contributed to the incredible capability she was now experiencing firsthand. The aircraft responded to Morrison's commands with precision that bordered on telepathy. When he wanted to climb, they climbed. When he wanted to turn, they turned with grace that defied the laws of physics. Maria realized that her maintenance work wasn't just about keeping machines operational. It was about enabling human beings to transcend their natural limitations and achieve something approaching flight in its purest form.
An hour into the flight, as they completed another series of systems checks at 40,000 feet, Morrison's voice came through the intercom with a tone Maria had never heard before. Casual, almost conversational, but with an undertone of serious purpose. "Santos, I've got a question for you." "Yes, sir," Maria replied, still focused on the instrument panel where engine parameters scrolled past in neat, organized rows. "In all your years maintaining F-22s, have you ever wondered what it would feel like to actually control one?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow. Of course she had wondered, every day. Every time she watched a pilot climb into a cockpit she had just prepared. Every time she saw an F-22 disappear into the sky, carrying someone else's dreams. But wondering and admitting to wondering were two very different things, especially when talking to a pilot who lived the reality she could only imagine. "Everyone who works around these aircraft wonders about that, sir," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked," Morrison replied, echoing his words from their morning conversation on the flight line. "I asked about you specifically." Maria hesitated. In the military, there were certain boundaries that weren't supposed to be crossed, certain hierarchies that were meant to be maintained. Maintenance personnel weren't supposed to harbor ambitions beyond their assigned roles, especially not ambitions as audacious as actually flying the aircraft they serviced. But sitting at 40,000 feet in the back seat of the most advanced fighter jet ever built, those boundaries felt less absolute than they had on the ground. "Yes, sir," she admitted quietly, "every single day." Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Maria could see his helmet silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky ahead of them. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made her pay attention in a way that went beyond military protocol. "Santos, I've been flying for 12 years. I've flown with academy graduates, officer candidate school graduates, and pilots from every background you can imagine.
I've flown with people who were handed opportunities and people who fought for every chance they got. And I can tell you something with absolute certainty. The best pilots aren't necessarily the ones who had the clearest path to the cockpit. Maria felt her heart rate increase, though whether from the altitude, the G-forces, or Morrison's words, she couldn't tell. The best pilots are the ones who understand these aircraft so completely that flying becomes an extension of their understanding rather than a separate skill they had to learn. They're the ones who can feel when something isn't right, who can interpret what the aircraft is telling them, who can make the machine do things that seem impossible because they know exactly what's possible. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at," Maria said, though part of her was beginning to suspect exactly where this conversation was headed. Morrison made a gentle turn to the left, and Maria watched the horizon rotate around them with a smoothness that seemed effortless, but required incredible skill to execute properly. "What I'm getting at, Santos, is that I've been watching you work for 2 years. I've seen how you interact with these aircraft. You don't just maintain them, you communicate with them. You understand them at a level that most pilots never achieve." Maria's mouth felt dry despite the oxygen flowing through her mask. "Captain Morrison, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "Today's test mission includes evaluation of the flight control systems under various conditions. That evaluation requires someone in the back seat to take control of the aircraft and verify that all systems respond appropriately to inputs from the second seat." Maria's world stopped. The instrument panels in front of her, the sky around them, even her own breathing seemed to pause as she processed what Morrison had just said. "Sir, are you saying—" "I'm saying that the test profile calls for you to take the controls and demonstrate that this aircraft responds appropriately to commands from the back seat. It's a legitimate systems test, Santos. The fact that it involves you actually flying an F-22 is just a side effect of the mission requirements." Maria stared at the control stick between her legs, the throttles to her left, and the instrument panel in front of her. For years, she had seen these controls in parked aircraft, had moved them during maintenance procedures, had tested their range of motion, and verified their connections. But the idea of using them for their intended purpose, actually controlling an aircraft in flight, seemed impossible. "I don't have pilot training," she said weakly. "No, but you have something better. You have understanding, and right now at 40,000 feet with unlimited visibility and no traffic, you have the perfect environment to discover what that understanding really means." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she looked at the flight controls. Every switch, every button, every display made sense to her from a technical perspective. She knew what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to work, and what would happen when they were activated. But knowing and doing were separated by a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. "What if I mess up?" she asked. Morrison's voice carried absolute confidence when he replied, "Santos, I've trusted you with my life every time I've flown an aircraft you've maintained. Today, I'm asking you to trust me with yours. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or to this aircraft, but I am going to give you the chance to discover what you're really capable of." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a gentleness that Maria had never heard from him before. "Besides, if you can keep an F-22 running perfectly for 8 years without a single failure, how hard can it be to fly one for a few minutes?" Maria looked out at the endless sky around them, at the instrument panel that suddenly looked less like a collection of gauges and more like a conversation waiting to happen, and at the control stick that represented the difference between dreams and reality. "What do I need to do?" she asked.
First, let's start with the basics. Morrison's voice was calm, professional, the tone of an instructor who had guided many students through their first experiences with flight controls. Put your hands lightly on the stick and throttles. Don't grip them. Just rest your hands there and feel what the aircraft is telling you. Maria's hands moved almost without conscious direction, settling onto the controls that she had inspected and tested countless times, but never used for their intended purpose. The stick felt alive in her grip, trembling slightly with the micro vibrations of the aircraft systems. The throttles were warm under her left hand, their position corresponding to the power settings that were keeping them aloft at 40,000 feet. "Good," Morrison said. "What you're feeling right now is the aircraft in balanced flight. The stick pressure tells you what the control surfaces are doing, the throttle position tells you how much power we're using, and the instruments tell you the story of what the aircraft is experiencing." Maria tried to process the sensory overload of information flowing through her hands. She could feel the slight resistance in the stick that indicated the aircraft's natural stability, the way it wanted to maintain its current attitude and altitude. The throttles thrummed with the power of engines producing over 35,000 pounds of thrust each. Now, I want you to make a very gentle input to the right with the stick, just a tiny movement. Imagine you're turning a page in a book. Maria moved the stick slightly to the right, and the world outside the canopy began to tilt. The horizon, which had been perfectly level across her field of vision, started to rotate as the F-22 entered a gentle bank to the right. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The feeling of controlling a machine that weighed 65,000 pounds and was traveling at hundreds of miles per hour with nothing more than the pressure of her fingers. "Outstanding," Morrison said. "You're flying an F-22 Raptor, Santos. How does it feel?" "Incredible," Maria whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. "It's so responsive." "Now level the wings by moving the stick gently back to center." Maria reversed her input, and the aircraft rolled back to level flight with precision that seemed supernatural. The F-22's fly-by-wire flight control system interpreted her commands and executed them with perfection that removed any sloppiness or overcorrection from her inexperienced inputs. "The computer is helping you," Morrison explained, as if reading her thoughts. "This aircraft has flight control systems that make it impossible to exceed safe parameters accidentally. It's interpreting what you want to do and helping you do it smoothly and safely." Over the next several minutes, Morrison guided Maria through basic control inputs. She learned to use the rudder pedals to coordinate turns, to adjust throttle settings to maintain altitude during climbs and descents, and to read the attitude indicator that showed the aircraft's relationship to the horizon in three-dimensional space. Each control input felt natural, as if her years of maintaining these systems had prepared her subconsciously for this moment. When Morrison told her to climb, she instinctively pulled back on the stick while adding power with the throttles. When he asked for a descent, she pushed forward gently while reducing thrust. The aircraft responded to her commands with the precision of a surgical instrument. "Try a 360-degree turn to the left," Morrison instructed. "Start with about a 30-degree bank angle and maintain altitude throughout the turn." Maria took a deep breath and moved the stick to the left. The F-22 rolled into the turn with graceful precision, and she found herself looking down at the earth below from an angle that made her stomach flutter with excitement. The Virginia countryside spread out beneath them like a three-dimensional map, with rivers snaking through forests and cities connected by highways that looked like silver threads. Maintaining altitude during the turn required constant adjustment of back pressure on the stick and slight power changes. Maria discovered that flying was less like driving a car and more like conducting an orchestra. Every control input affected multiple aspects of the aircraft's behavior, and smooth flight required coordinating all of them simultaneously. "You're a natural," Morrison said, as Maria completed the turn and rolled back to level flight. "Your altitude variation was less than 50 feet through that entire maneuver. Most student pilots would have lost or gained several hundred feet." Maria felt a surge of pride that was quickly tempered by disbelief. "I can't believe this is actually happening." "Believe it," Morrison replied. "You're not just along for the ride anymore, Santos. You're flying this aircraft." For the next 20 minutes, Morrison gradually introduced more complex maneuvers. Maria learned to perform coordinated turns at various bank angles, to climb and descend at specific rates, and to adjust power settings to maintain desired airspeeds. Each new skill built on the previous one, creating a foundation of understanding that made the next challenge seem achievable.
The most remarkable aspect was how natural it felt. Maria had expected flying to be overwhelmingly complex, requiring split-second decisions and constant crisis management. Instead, it felt like an extension of her existing relationship with the aircraft. She understood what the aircraft wanted to do, what it was capable of, and how to work with its systems rather than fight against them. "All right, Santos," Morrison said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I'm going to give you complete control of the aircraft. I'll keep my hands and feet ready to assist if needed. But for the next few minutes, you're pilot in command. Show me what you can do." Maria felt a moment of panic at the responsibility, but it was quickly replaced by determination. She was no longer just maintaining an F-22, she was commanding one. The distinction felt profound and empowering. "Roger, I have the aircraft," she said, using the standard phraseology she had heard pilots use countless times. "You have the aircraft," Morrison confirmed. For the first time in her Air Force career, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was the pilot in command of an F-22 Raptor. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, but as she settled into the role, she discovered that her years of technical knowledge had prepared her for this moment in ways she had never imagined. The aircraft felt like an extension of her will, responding to her thoughts almost before she translated them into control inputs. When she wanted to turn, the aircraft turned. When she wanted to climb or descend, it obeyed with precision that seemed telepathic. The gap between her maintenance expertise and piloting ability, which seemed insurmountable from the ground, proved to be far smaller than she had ever dared to hope. "How does it feel to be in command?" Morrison asked. Maria looked out at the vast sky around them, felt the powerful engines responding to her throttle inputs, and experienced the incredible freedom of three-dimensional flight under her direct control. "Like coming home," she said, quietly, and realized she meant it completely.
With Maria now in full control of the F-22, Morrison began introducing challenges that would test not just her natural flying ability, but her deep understanding of the aircraft's systems and capabilities. What started as basic flight maneuvers was about to become something far more sophisticated. "Santos, I want you to demonstrate something for me," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of someone about to issue a significant challenge. "Take us down to 30,000 feet, but I want you to do it while maintaining exactly 450 knots airspeed. Use whatever combination of throttle and flight control inputs you need." This was no longer basic flying. This was precision aircraft management that required understanding the complex relationships between power, attitude, airspeed, and altitude. Maria felt her heart rate increase, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She began by reducing throttle settings while simultaneously lowering the nose slightly. The F-22 entered a controlled descent, and Maria watched the airspeed indicator carefully, making minute adjustments to maintain exactly 450 knots as they descended. Too steep an angle and the airspeed would increase beyond her target. Too shallow and they wouldn't descend efficiently while maintaining the required speed. "Outstanding technique," Morrison observed, as they passed through 35,000 feet with the airspeed locked precisely on 450 knots. "You're thinking like a pilot, not just flying like one." Maria felt a surge of confidence, but she forced herself to remain focused on the task. The descent required constant attention as air density changed with altitude, affecting both engine performance and aerodynamic characteristics. She found herself making the same intuitive adjustments that she had seen experienced pilots make, compensating for variables before they became problems. As they leveled at 30,000 feet, Morrison presented her with an even greater challenge. "I'm going to simulate a system malfunction," he said. "This is something we do regularly in training flights. I want you to respond based on your understanding of aircraft systems and emergency procedures." Maria's maintenance background suddenly became crucial. She knew every backup system, every redundancy, every emergency procedure that existed in the F-22's complex architecture. This wasn't just flying anymore. This was system management at the highest level. Hydraulic system pressure is dropping in the number 1 system, Morrison announced, manipulating controls in the front cockpit to simulate the malfunction. What's your response? Without hesitation, Maria began running through the emergency checklist that she knew by heart from years of maintaining hydraulic systems. Switching to backup hydraulic system, monitoring pressure in the remaining systems, and checking for any secondary effects on flight controls. She made the appropriate switch changes while maintaining level flight, demonstrating that her technical knowledge translated seamlessly into operational capability. The F-22 continued to fly normally on its backup systems, but Maria knew that certain maneuvers were now limited and that fuel consumption would be affected. Perfect response, Morrison said. Now, let's see how you handle a more complex scenario. For the next several minutes, Morrison introduced a series of simulated malfunctions and system failures that would challenge even experienced pilots. Each scenario required Maria to draw on her deep understanding of aircraft systems while maintaining safe flight. She handled engine parameter anomalies, navigation system failures, and communication equipment problems with the competence of someone who had spent years troubleshooting these exact systems from the ground. What amazed both of them was how naturally her maintenance expertise translated into flying skills. When Morrison simulated an engine overheat, Maria didn't just follow emergency procedures, she understood why each step was necessary and could anticipate what would happen next. When he created a simulated electrical problem, she knew not just which switches to throw, but what the consequences would be for other systems throughout the aircraft. Santos, I'd have to ask you something, Morrison said as they completed another emergency procedure. Have you been studying pilot training materials? No, sir, Maria replied, but I've been troubleshooting these systems for 8 years. I understand what they're supposed to do and what happens when they don't work properly. That's exactly what I thought. You're not just flying this aircraft, you're managing it. There's a difference, and it's the difference between good pilots and great pilots. As they continued their flight, Morrison began introducing maneuvers that showcased the F-22's unique capabilities. They performed thrust vectoring demonstrations that allowed the aircraft to point its nose in directions that seemed to defy physics. Maria learned to use the F-22's ability to control its exhaust direction to execute turns that would be impossible in conventional aircraft. Feel that? Morrison asked as they completed a maneuver that involved pointing the nose 60 degrees off their direction of travel while maintaining controlled flight. I feel like the aircraft is ignoring the laws of physics, Maria marveled. Not ignoring them, transcending them. This is what happens when you combine advanced aerodynamics with thrust vectoring and computer-controlled flight systems. The aircraft can do things that no human pilot could manage without technological assistance. Maria was beginning to understand that flying an F-22 wasn't just about stick and rudder skills. It was about becoming part of a human-machine interface that amplified human capability beyond anything that had existed before. Her years of understanding the machine side of that interface suddenly made perfect sense as preparation for understanding the human side. How much time do we have left? She asked, dreading the inevitable return to Earth and the end of this incredible experience. About 30 minutes. But before we head home, there's one more thing I want to show you. Maria felt her pulse quicken. Each new challenge had pushed her capabilities further, and she couldn't imagine what Morrison might have planned for the final phase of their flight. What's that, sir? Morrison's voice carried a tone of anticipation that made Maria pay close attention. I want to show you what this aircraft can really do when it's being flown by someone who truly understands it.
Santos, what I'm about to teach you isn't in any manual, Morrison said as they cruised at 30,000 feet with unlimited visibility in every direction. This is the kind of flying that comes from understanding an aircraft so completely that you stop thinking about operating it and start thinking with it. Maria felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Every challenge Morrison had presented so far had pushed her beyond what she thought possible. But his tone suggested that they were about to venture into territory that even experienced pilots rarely explored. The F-22 is capable of maneuvers that most pilots never attempt because they require perfect understanding of the aircraft's systems and limitations, Morrison continued. But you know these systems better than most pilots know their own cars. That knowledge is about to become your greatest asset. Morrison walked Maria through a series of advanced maneuvers that showcased the F-22's extraordinary capabilities. They performed vertical climbs that pressed her deep into her seat as the aircraft pointed straight up and climbed on pure thrust. They executed knife-edge flight, where the aircraft flew sideways with one wing pointing directly at the ground and the other at the sky. Each maneuver required precise coordination of thrust vectoring, flight controls, and power management. Maria discovered that her maintenance background gave her an intuitive understanding of what the aircraft was doing and why it was able to perform these seemingly impossible feats. "Try this," Morrison said, setting up for a maneuver Maria had never seen before. "I want you to bring us to a complete stop in midair." "Sir?" Maria wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "The F-22 can achieve controlled flight at 0 airspeed using thrust vectoring. The engines provide enough directed thrust to maintain altitude and attitude even when there's no air flowing over the wings. It's like hovering, but at 30,000 feet. Under Morrison's guidance, Maria gradually reduced their airspeed while adjusting the thrust vector angles to maintain altitude and control. The aircraft's computer systems worked constantly to interpret her inputs and maintain stability as they approached the edge of conventional flight. As their airspeed decreased below 100 knots, then 50 knots, Maria felt the aircraft's behavior change dramatically. Normal aerodynamic controls became less effective, but the thrust vectoring system compensated by directing engine output to provide the control authority they needed. "Airspeed 0, Morrison announced as they achieved a stable hover at 30,000 feet. "You just brought 65,000 pounds of fighter aircraft to a complete stop in midair. How does that feel?" Maria stared at the airspeed indicator showing 0, while the altimeter remained steady. They were suspended in space by nothing but the directed thrust of their engines, defying every natural law of flight that had governed aviation for over a century. "Impossible," she whispered. "Nothing's impossible when you understand your equipment," Morrison replied. "This is what happens when advanced technology meets genuine expertise." They held the hover for nearly a minute, giving Maria time to feel the aircraft's behavior in this unique flight regime. The controls responded differently, requiring constant small inputs to maintain position, but the principle was the same as everything else they had done: understanding what the aircraft needed and providing it through the appropriate controls. "Now," said Morrison, "let's see what happens when we transition back to normal flight." Maria gradually increased thrust while adjusting the vector angles, and the F-22 smoothly transitioned from hover to forward flight. The transformation felt magical. One moment they were suspended motionless in space, the next they were accelerating forward with the familiar feel of air flowing over the wings. "That maneuver isn't just about showing off," Morrison explained as they settled into cruise flight. "It demonstrates the kind of capability that comes from truly understanding your aircraft. In combat, that understanding could mean the difference between life and death." For the remaining time in their advanced maneuvering phase, Morrison introduced Maria to concepts that pushed both the aircraft and her understanding to their limits. They explored high angle of attack flight, where the aircraft's nose pointed far above the horizon while maintaining controlled flight. They practiced energy management techniques that allowed them to convert altitude into speed and speed into altitude, with precision that turned the sky into a three-dimensional playing field. Each maneuver built on Maria's growing confidence and deepening understanding of what the F-22 could do. More importantly, she was learning what she could do when given the opportunity to apply her knowledge in its intended environment. "Santos, I want you to understand something," Morrison said as they prepared to transition to their final phase of flight. "What you've accomplished today isn't beginner's luck or natural talent, though you have plenty of both. This is what happens when someone who truly understands aircraft systems gets the chance to use that understanding at the highest level."
Maria felt emotions she couldn't quite name: pride, gratitude, and something deeper that she couldn't articulate. For 8 years, she had been told that her role was important, but secondary, that maintenance was crucial, but not as exciting or meaningful as flying. Today had shattered that artificial distinction. "I never realized that maintenance and flying were so connected," she said. "They're not just connected," Morrison replied. "At this level, they're the same thing. The best pilots are the ones who understand their aircraft completely, and the best maintainers are the ones who understand what the aircraft is meant to accomplish. You've been a pilot all along, Santos. You just needed the chance to prove it." As they prepared for their final maneuvers before returning to base, Maria realized that this flight had changed more than just her perspective on aviation. It had changed her understanding of her own capabilities and her place in the complex world of military aviation. "Ready for the final challenge?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir," Maria replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being.
For your final test, Morrison announced as they cruised through the crystal clear sky at 35,000 feet, "I'm going to give you a scenario that every F-22 pilot trains for, but hopes never to encounter in real life." Maria felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. Everything they had done so far had been challenging, but conducted in controlled conditions, with Morrison ready to take control if needed. His tone suggested that this final test would be different, more realistic, more demanding, and potentially more dangerous. "I'm going to simulate a combat scenario," Morrison continued. "You'll be responsible for aircraft management, threat detection, and tactical maneuvering. This isn't just flying anymore, Santos. This is combat systems operation." Maria's maintenance background had given her theoretical knowledge of the F-22's combat systems, but using them operationally was entirely different from testing them on the ground. The heads-up display in her helmet began showing tactical information, simulated threats, navigation waypoints, and systems status displays that transformed the peaceful sky into a complex tactical environment. "I'm going to simulate a combat scenario," Morrison continued. "You'll be responsible for aircraft management, threat detection, and tactical maneuvering. This isn't just flying anymore, Santos. This is combat systems operation." Maria's maintenance background had given her intuitive understanding of what each system could and couldn't do, but her flying skills allowed her to implement tactical solutions that leveraged the F-22's full capabilities. "Remember," Morrison said, "stealth isn't just about the aircraft's design. It's about how you fly it. Altitude, speed, and flight path all affect your radar signature." Maria began adjusting their flight profile based on her understanding of stealth technology. She knew that the F-22's radar cross-section was minimized when approaching threats from certain angles, and that flying at specific altitudes could use terrain masking to avoid detection. Her years of studying stealth systems from a maintenance perspective suddenly became operationally relevant. "Threat radar at 2 o'clock, Morrison announced, simulating the kind of real-time threat call that pilots receive in actual combat. "SAM site with search radar active." Maria immediately adjusted their course to approach the threat from an angle that would minimize their radar signature while maintaining progress toward their objective. She reduced power slightly to lower their infrared signature and adjusted their altitude to stay within the optimal stealth envelope. "Good thinking," Morrison observed. "You're not just avoiding the threat, you're managing your signature across multiple spectrums." As they progressed through the simulated threat environment, Maria found herself making the kind of split-second decisions that combat pilots face in real operations. When multiple threats appeared simultaneously, she had to prioritize which ones posed the greatest danger and adjust her tactics accordingly. When their original flight path became untenable due to threat positioning, she had to rapidly calculate alternative routes that would accomplish their mission while maintaining their survival. The most challenging aspect was coordinating
all the F-22 systems while maintaining situational awareness and flying the aircraft. She had to monitor threat indicators, manage stealth systems, navigate to their target, and fly complex tactical maneuvers, all at the same time. It was like playing three-dimensional chess while operating a supercomputer and conducting a symphony orchestra simultaneously. Incoming missile threat, Morrison announced, escalating the scenario to its highest level. You have 30 seconds to defeat the threat and continue the mission. Maria's training kicked in automatically. She rolled the aircraft into a steep defensive turn while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the simulated missile's guidance system. Simultaneously, she activated electronic countermeasures and adjusted their flight path to maximize the effectiveness of their defensive systems. The maneuver required precise coordination of flight controls, defensive systems, and tactical planning. Maria had to think several steps ahead, not just how to defeat the immediate threat, but how to position themselves for success against follow-up attacks while continuing toward their objective. Target area reached, Maria announced as they arrived at the final waypoint of their simulated mission. All objectives accomplished. Morrison was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone of respect that Maria had never heard directed at her before. Santos, what you just accomplished isn't something most pilots could do without months of specialized training. You integrated flying skills, systems knowledge, and tactical thinking at a level that typically requires years to develop. Maria felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the realization that this incredible experience was about to end. In a few minutes, they would be back on the ground, and she would return to her role as maintenance personnel, while Morrison continued his career as a pilot. "How does it feel to know you could do this job?" Morrison asked. Maria looked out at the vast sky that had become her temporary domain, felt the responsive controls of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, and realized that her answer would determine how she viewed herself for the rest of her career. "Like I've been living only half a life," she said quietly.
As their fuel levels indicated it was time to return to base, Maria felt a profound sense of loss that she couldn't quite articulate. The past 2 hours had been a revelation, not just about flying, but about her own capabilities and potential. The idea of landing, climbing out of the cockpit, and returning to her normal duties felt like voluntarily walking back into a cage after experiencing complete freedom. Langley approach, Ghost Rider 01, requesting vectors for approach and landing. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, initiating their return to the world below. Ghost Rider 01, Langley approach, turn left heading 090, descend and maintain 15,000 feet, expect runway 03 left for landing, came the response from air traffic control. Maria began the descent under Morrison's guidance, but this time her inputs were those of an experienced pilot rather than a curious passenger. She managed the power reduction, adjusted their flight path, and coordinated the complex process of transitioning from high-altitude cruise flight to approach configuration. "You know, Santos," Morrison said as they descended through 20,000 feet, "this flight will be documented in both our records. The mission report will show that you successfully completed advanced F-22 systems evaluation and demonstrated proficiency in all flight regimes tested." Maria wasn't sure what that meant for her future, but she understood that something significant had happened today beyond just an unusual training flight. The tone in Morrison's voice suggested that this experience might have consequences beyond the immediate thrill of flying. As they passed through 10,000 feet, the familiar landmarks of Virginia came into clear view. Maria could see Langley Air Force Base in the distance, its runways and hangars growing larger as they approached. The perspective was different now. Instead of seeing it as the place where she worked on the ground, she was seeing it as a pilot approaching for landing. "I want you to fly the approach," Morrison said as Maria once again surprised him. "I'll handle the radio calls and monitor the systems, but you're going to bring us home." The responsibility of landing an F-22 felt enormous, but Maria found that her confidence had grown throughout the flight. She understood the aircraft's behavior, trusted its systems, and had developed the situational awareness needed to manage the complex task of getting 65,000 pounds of fighter aircraft safely back on the ground.
Following Morrison's instructions, Maria configured the aircraft for landing, extending the landing gear, adjusting flaps, and managing the approach speed with precision that came from understanding rather than just following procedures. The F-22 responded to her inputs with the same responsiveness it had shown throughout their flight. "Looking good," Morrison observed as they established themselves on final approach. Speed, altitude, and glide path all perfect. Maria could see the runway ahead, its familiar markers and lights now representing the end point of an experience that had changed her understanding of what was possible. The approach required constant small adjustments to maintain the precise flight path needed for a safe landing, but each correction felt natural and appropriate. As they crossed the runway threshold, Maria reduced power and raised the nose slightly to arrest their descent. The F-22 touched down with barely a bump, its main landing gear making contact with the runway she had walked across countless times but never approached from this angle. "Outstanding landing," Morrison said as they rolled out and turned off the runway. "You just completed your first F-22 flight from takeoff to landing." As they taxied back to the ramp, Maria tried to process what had just happened. 2 hours ago, she had been a maintenance technician who dreamed of flying. Now she was a maintenance technician who had actually flown, and the difference felt profound and permanent. The engines spooled down to idle as they reached their parking spot, and Maria realized that the sound she had heard thousands of times from the ground carried entirely different meaning when experienced from the cockpit. These weren't just machines she maintained, they were partners in an experience that transcended anything she had imagined possible. "Before we shut down," Morrison said, "I want you to understand what happened here today. This wasn't just a training flight or a favor to a good maintainer. What you demonstrated today was pilot-level competency achieved through a combination of technical knowledge and natural ability that's extremely rare." Maria felt tears forming in her eyes, though whether from joy, sadness, or overwhelming emotion, she couldn't tell. "The mission report I file will document your performance in detail. That report will become part of your personnel record, and it will show that you have demonstrated F-22 pilot proficiency at a level that exceeds many pilots with significantly more flight time." As they completed the shutdown checklist and prepared to climb out of the aircraft, Maria realized that while this flight was ending, its implications were just beginning. She didn't know what opportunities might arise from Morrison's documentation of her performance, but she knew that she could never again think of herself as just maintenance. "Ready to return to the real world?" Morrison asked as they prepared to open the canopy. Maria looked one last time at the instrument panel that had been her window into the world of advanced flight, felt the controls that had responded to her commands with precision and grace, and realized that the real world would never look the same again. "Yes, sir," she said, "but I don't think I'll ever be the same person who climbed into this cockpit 2 hours ago." Morrison smiled as the canopy opened and fresh air flowed into the cockpit and said, "That's exactly the point, Santos. That's exactly the point." The days following Maria's flight passed in a blur of routine maintenance duties that felt surreal after her experience at 45,000 feet. Every time she opened an engine compartment, her hands remembered the throttles that had controlled those same engines in flight. Every time she tested a flight control surface, she could feel the memory of how those controls had responded to her commands in the air. The familiar tasks remained the same, but Maria's relationship with them had been fundamentally transformed. Word of her flight had spread quietly through the squadron, as word always does in tight-knit military units. Other maintainers looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and envy, wondering what it had been like to experience the other side of their professional lives. Pilots nodded to her with a new kind of respect, recognizing her as someone who had crossed the invisible barrier between ground and air, between supporting the mission and executing it. 3 days after the flight, Maria was called to Colonel Chen's office. She knocked on the doorframe and was invited to enter, finding not just the colonel, but also Morrison and 2 other officers she didn't recognize, a general with pilot wings and another colonel with test pilot credentials. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Colonel Chen began, "please have a seat. I believe you know Captain Morrison. This is General Patricia Williams, commander of our test wing, and Colonel Michael Rodriguez, our director of pilot evaluation."
Maria felt her heart rate increase as she took the offered chair. The presence of such high-ranking officers suggested that Morrison's mission report had generated more attention than she had expected. General Williams spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected people's entire careers. Sergeant Santos, Captain Morrison's mission report makes for very interesting reading. According to his documentation, you demonstrated F-22 pilot proficiency that exceeded his expectations and, in some areas, exceeded the performance of pilots with significantly more flight time. Maria tried to process what she was hearing. Ma'am, Captain Morrison was an excellent instructor and the aircraft systems made everything easier than it would have been otherwise. Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward. Sergeant, I've reviewed Captain Morrison's report in detail, including his assessment of your systems management, emergency procedures, and tactical decision-making. What you accomplished wasn't the result of good instruction or advanced technology. It was the result of exceptional understanding and natural ability. More importantly, General Williams continued, your performance in that cockpit was better than most pilots I've flown with. You didn't just learn to fly the F-22, you understood it. There's a difference, and it's the difference between competent pilots and exceptional ones. Morrison opened a folder on the desk in front of her. Santos, your performance in that cockpit was better than most pilots I've flown with. You didn't just learn to fly the F-22, you understood it. There's a difference, and it's the difference between competent pilots and exceptional ones. General Williams opened a folder on the desk in front of her. Sergeant Santos, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. If you had the opportunity to pursue pilot training specifically focused on your technical background and demonstrated abilities, would you be interested? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Maria felt 8 years of buried dreams suddenly demanding attention, but she also felt the weight of practical considerations that had shaped her career to this point. Ma'am, I would be very interested, but I understood my initial test scores weren't sufficient for pilot training. Colonel Rodriguez smiled. Traditional pilot training is designed for candidates with broad educational backgrounds but limited technical knowledge. What we're discussing would be a specialized track for candidates with demonstrated technical expertise and proven ability to integrate that knowledge with flight operations. In other words, Colonel Chen added, we're talking about a pilot training program designed specifically for people like you, maintainers who understand aircraft systems at the expert level and have demonstrated the ability to apply that knowledge operationally. Maria struggled to maintain her composure as the implications of what they were discussing became clear. This wasn't just about her individual case. They were talking about a fundamental change in how the Air Force identified and developed pilot talent. General Williams continued, your case has prompted us to reevaluate our assumptions about pilot candidate selection. We believe there may be significant untapped potential among experienced maintenance personnel who understand aircraft systems but have never had the opportunity to demonstrate flight capabilities. The program we're proposing would be experimental, Morrison explained. You would be part of a small group of maintenance professionals who would undergo specialized pilot training designed to leverage your existing technical knowledge rather than starting from scratch. Maria felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that the flight with Morrison hadn't just been an isolated experience, it had been the beginning of something much larger. Ma'am, she said, addressing General Williams, what would this program involve? 6 months of intensive flight training focused specifically on advanced aircraft systems and tactical operations, the general replied. Instead of spending time learning basic aircraft systems, you would focus on advanced flight techniques, tactical decision-making, and operational integration. Colonel Rodriguez added, upon successful completion, you would be qualified as an F-22 pilot with a specialty in systems integration and technical operations. You would fly operational missions while also serving as a technical expert for other pilots and maintenance personnel. Maria realized that they were offering her something beyond her wildest dreams, not just the opportunity to become a pilot, but to become a pilot in a way that honored and utilized her maintenance background rather than abandoning it. When would this program begin? She asked, hardly believing she was actually asking the question. General Williams smiled. The first class would begin in 8 weeks. We have funding for 5 candidates, and based on Captain Morrison's report and your performance, you would be our first selection." Maria looked around the room at the faces of the officers who were offering to transform her life, then back at Morrison, who had made it all possible by believing in her potential when she had stopped believing in herself. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions overwhelming her. "I would be honored to accept."
6 months later, newly commissioned Second Lieutenant Maria Santos walked across the same flight line where she had spent 8 years as a maintenance technician. But now she wore pilot wings on her flight suit and carried her own helmet to her own assigned F-22 Raptor. The familiar sounds, smells, and sights of the flight line hadn't changed, but her relationship with them had been completely transformed. The experimental pilot training program had been everything General Williams had promised, and more. Instead of learning aircraft systems from scratch, Maria had focused on advanced flight techniques, tactical operations, and the complex art of integrating technical knowledge with operational decision-making in real-time combat scenarios. Her classmates in the program had been equally impressive, a crew chief with 15 years of experience on KC-135 tankers, an avionics specialist who could troubleshoot radar systems blindfolded, a propulsion expert who understood jet engines better than most engineers, and a flight controls technician who had literally written some of the maintenance procedures they all used. Together, they had formed the first class of what the Air Force was now calling the Technical Pilot Program. The training had been intensive and challenging, but Maria's experience during that first flight with Morrison had prepared her for the integration of technical knowledge and flight operations that the program demanded. While traditional pilot candidates spent months learning aircraft systems, Maria and her classmates had used that time to master advanced tactics, multi-aircraft operations, and the kind of complex mission planning that typically took years to develop. Now, as she approached her assigned F-22, Maria saw Staff Sergeant Jennifer Park performing the pre-flight inspection. Park was one of the maintainers who had worked under Maria's supervision before her transition to pilot training, and the role reversal felt both strange and meaningful. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Park said, snapping to attention as Maria approached. "Good morning, Jenny," Maria replied, deliberately using the informal name to maintain the relationship they had built when she was still in maintenance. "How's she looking today?" Park smiled, relaxing slightly. "All systems green, ma'am. I replaced the number 1 engine's fuel nozzle yesterday. It was showing slightly irregular spray patterns. Nothing dangerous, but I wanted to be sure." Maria nodded, recognizing her own approach to maintenance in Park's thoroughness. "Good catch. That kind of attention to detail is what keeps us safe up there." As Maria conducted her own inspection of the aircraft, she saw it through the dual perspective that had become her trademark in the pilot community. She understood the technical aspects of every system from her maintenance background, but she also understood their operational significance from her pilot training. This combination had made her and her classmates uniquely effective pilots who could diagnose problems in flight that might stump others and make tactical decisions based on deep understanding of aircraft capabilities and limitations. Morrison appeared as Maria completed her pre-flight inspection. He now wore major's leaves on his collar, having been promoted partly in recognition of his role in developing the technical pilot program. "Ready for your first official mission as aircraft commander?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Maria replied, though her confidence was genuine. Today's mission would be her first as pilot in command of an operational F-22 flight, leading a 2-ship formation on a training mission that would test everything she had learned. "You know," Morrison said, "when I invited you on that flight 8 months ago, I had a feeling something like this might happen, but I never imagined it would lead to a complete program." Maria looked at the F-22 that would soon be her responsibility to command. "I never imagined any of this. 8 months ago, I thought I knew what my career would look like. I thought I knew what my limitations were." "That's the thing about limitations," Morrison said. "Most of them exist only in our minds. The real ones, the physical laws, the actual capabilities of machines and human beings, those are usually much more generous than we imagine."
As Maria strapped into the cockpit that had once seemed impossibly out of reach, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The transition from maintenance to pilot hadn't just changed her job, it had changed her understanding of what was possible when expertise met opportunity. Her wingman for today's mission was Captain Sarah Mitchell, a traditionally trained pilot who had initially been skeptical of the technical pilot program, but had become one of its strongest supporters after flying with Maria and her classmates. The combination of traditional pilot skills and technical expertise had proven to be incredibly effective in operational situations. Ghost Rider Flight Tower winds 090 at 8, runway 03 left. Cleared for takeoff, came the call from air traffic control. Ghost Rider 01, cleared for takeoff, Maria replied, advancing the throttles and feeling the familiar surge of acceleration that had once seemed magical, but now felt like coming home. As they climbed into the Virginia sky, Maria thought about the maintainers on the ground who keep these aircraft flying, many of whom might have their own dreams of experiencing flight from the other side. The technical pilot program was expanding, with plans to evaluate candidates from all aircraft maintenance specialties across the Air Force. At 35,000 feet, leading her own formation through the same sky where Morrison had first handed her the controls, Maria keyed her radio for the mission briefing that would begin their training objectives. But first, she allowed herself a moment to appreciate the view. The same infinite blue sky that had captured her imagination as a child in Texas. The same realm of possibility that had seemed forever beyond her reach, until a captain named Morrison decided that limitations were meant to be challenged. Ghost Rider 02, this is lead, she called to her wingman. Mission commences now. Let's show them what technical pilots can do. As they rolled into the first maneuver of their training mission, Maria realized that her story had come full circle. But it wasn't ending. It was beginning. Every maintenance technician who looked up at the sky and wondered, what if, now had a new answer to that question. The technical pilot program had proven that expertise could be transformed into opportunity, that understanding could become flight, and that the distance between maintaining dreams and living them might be smaller than anyone had dared to imagine. The F-22 responded to her commands with the precision she had come to expect, but now it felt like partnership rather than mastery. She wasn't just flying the aircraft, she was continuing a conversation with it that had begun 8 years ago when she first learned to understand its systems, deepened when Morrison first handed her the controls, and would continue as long as she wore pilot wings. Below them, other maintainers were performing the same duties Maria had once performed, keeping America's most advanced fighters mission-ready through skill, dedication, and dreams that might be closer to reality than they knew. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly in all directions, no longer a ceiling, but a pathway to possibilities that had yet to be imagined. Lieutenant Maria Santos, former Staff Sergeant Santos, former dreamer turned pilot, rolled her F-22 into a climb toward the sun and smiled. Some stories end when dreams come true, but the best ones are just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.